This video is made for entertainment and educational purposes only. All photographs that are modern in nature are to help describe our story in the video. The photographs are used under the Fair Use Clause of the 1976 Copyright Act. We now begin with the turbulent history of the Tobacco Wars. Once again, we give the disclaimer that this is a historical story and is not to promote the use of tobacco or tobacco products. As we talk about this time in history, we are simply showing a light on a time of civil unrest in American history and how it has affected Kentucky and Tennessee. As the PPA became more radicalized, splinter groups began to form and started wreaking havoc upon the Black Patch tobacco area of the states. Come along with us as we walk through the terrifying night raids of 1904 through 1909. Dr. David Alfred Amoss, or Amos. Dr. Amos, in 1889, began to get involved in violent incidents in western Kentucky. He began taking part in the, quote, violent enforcement of morality, unquote. In the 1900s, Amos began attending the PPA meetings. He slowly found other radical people within the group who wanted to take vengeance and act violently to get things accomplished. The splinter group began holding secret meetings. Blood oaths and secrecy helped to secure everyone's loyalty to the insider group. Possum Hunters. The first splinter group from the PPA was the Possum Hunters. 32 members of the PPA met in Steinbach Schoolhouse in northern part of Robertson County, Tennessee in October of 1905. The group adopted the resolution of the Committee of the Possum Hunters organization and outlined their grievances against the trust and the hillbillies. In a statement of the resolution, it read, quote, "Be it further proclaimed to the world that any farmer or persons who aid the trust in any way by selling to it their tobacco at a higher price is an accomplice of the trust and is in good morals as guilty as the trust," unquote. There was also a public statement that was published in leaflet form and passed around to the farms that read, quote, "O fool, raise no tobacco. Notice, O fool, dare to raise a stalk of tobacco on your land or assist anyone else in raising, and ye shall pay the penalty with your home and life. So ye be warned, the night riders," unquote. They resolved to visit the trust and those that refused to join the group in numbers ranging from no less than 5 and more than 2,000 persons using peaceful methods. At first their methods were stern lectures, but it soon escalated into violent methods. The main object of the group was to intimidate and coerce others into joining the PPA. The idea quickly caught on and several possum hunter groups began to spring up in the area. They would meet under secrecy and under the cover of darkness in schoolhouses, country churches, and wooded areas. The Night Riders. Amos began using his former experience as a cadet and drill master at the Major Farrell's Military School in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, to perform paramilitary insurgents. The men began wearing masks, hoods, and robes and began covering their mounts' hooves with cloths to go undetected during their raids. By 1906, they reached an estimated 10,000 members for these raids. Calling themselves the Silent Brigade, as they would ride silently to the houses of their mark. They would beat up and scourge those who were non-compliant to the PPA, officials, and trust employees. They would burn down tobacco barns and fields. They would ruin fields by planting grass seed, plowing up the ground, or by throwing salt on the earth. The night raiders would also burn down the houses of the people who would not cooperate with the PPA. The first raid. On December 1st, 1906, several members of the PPA drifted into Princeton, Kentucky, the county seat of Caldwell County. Before the destruction began, several men quietly occupied the police and fire stations and seized the telegraph and telephone offices and shut down the city water supply. As darkness fell, the town went to sleep for the night. 200 robed and masked men rode into the town. As they shot off their guns, the townspeople began to awaken and turn on the house lights and come out to see what the disturbance was. They were immediately told to go back inside and turn off their lights, to which their windows and doors were smashed and broken. Some of the men went out into the tobacco fields and would either trample the fields, salt them, or if they had porous canvas upon them to protect the shoots, they would douse them with kerosene and light them on fire. This would completely destroy the field for the season, as it was too late for replanting. The raiders moved to the J.G. or tobacco factory and set the factory ablaze with kerosene and several sticks of dynamite placed for the total destruction of the building. The next building was the Stager and Dollar Warehouse to be set ablaze. That night, both buildings were completely destroyed along with 75 tons of non-PPA tobacco. Buck Duke's response and woes. The PPA was impeding Duke's business and the flow of tobacco was slowing down. His immediate thoughts upon the matter was that the associations were a group of men that were manipulated by outside people to subvert the American way of doing business. Compounded to the PPA and splinter groups' attacks on the tobacco crops was the new President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt just held a successful campaign of rabble-rousing and trust-busting promises. These promises reawakened the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. This legislation prohibited the anti-competitive business practices of Duke and other robber barons such as Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, and others. The people's response. The people loved the improvements to their lives that the actions of the PPA were making. They had more money to buy food, pay off their mortgages, and buy clothing. As the pro-trust warehouses were being burned down, the price of tobacco was going up and helping the smaller farmers. The second raid. As the Princeton raid began to spread quickly, Hopkinsville, Kentucky began to brace itself for the next raid. The citizens began to heavily arm themselves and the state militia stationed themselves in the city. Hopkinsville held two of the largest Duke Trust warehouses in the state. This made Hopkinsville a very tempting target for the night raiders. On the night of January 4th, 1907, Mayor Charles Meehan received a telephone call that night that the raiders were on their way. The call went out to all the citizens and they sat prepared for the raid that did not come that night. The hoax was a test to see if Hopkinsville was at the ready for an impending raid. Over the year, many of the raiders would drift in and out of town to see if the town was still ready to defend themselves. Several times the raiders would come to the city limits and would turn back as the alarm was sounded of their presence. On December 7, 1907, the Silent Brigade attacked Hopkinsville, Kentucky. They left their horses behind them as the 250 masked and robed men marched into town with military precision. Each time a light would turn on and a window would be shot out, the men guarded the entrances and exits of the city, seized the police and fire stations, captured the L&N rail depot, and took over the telephone and telegraph offices. Several people were taken as hostages and put into a makeshift corral on Main Street. Several businesses were destroyed and vandalized, as well as the newspaper office. Lindsay Mitchell, who was a buyer for a local tobacco company, was dragged out of his home and severely beaten and scourged. The Latham warehouse and the Tandy and Fairleigh warehouses were burned, which caused several private residences to burn as well. There were 2 injuries. J.C. Phelps, a brakeman for the railroad, was shot in the back but survived, and Dr. Amoss was shot in the head by one of his men and removed for treatment. When the raid was breaking up, Major Bassett, a commander for the militia, escaped out of the back of his house, gathered 11 men and mingled with the raiders. As they followed them out of town, a gunfight ensued and killed one man and wounded another. The election of Kentucky Governor Augustus E. Willson. Feeling like they had accomplished their goals, the groups began to break up and go back to their farms to till their crops. However, this changed with the election of Willson. He was a Republican attorney and a firm friend of big business. Many did not like him in the state of Kentucky at that time for his corporatist leanings and for his being from the city of Louisville, the only metropolitan area in the state. As a result of the PPA actions, the Kentucky Governor, Augustus E. Willson, ordered that the militia remain on active duty from December 1907 through November 1908. There were no active raids where the militia was stationed. The Russellville and Eddyville raids. Several raids went on in the city of Russellville, Kentucky. This was because the militia was busy guarding the Hopkinsville and other larger cities. The level of preparedness made the larger cities less of a tempting target. However, the PPA would not give up on its raids and found easier places to leave their mark. The first raid happened on January 3, 1908. Using the same methods as before, the raiders captured the towns of Dykesburg, View, and Eddyville, Kentucky, and burned down the Luckett Wake Tobacco Company and the American Snuff Company. There were several attacks on the citizens over the months, and the violence escalated. Many people were beaten and bloody in their wake. It was not until January 17th that the soldiers made it into these areas to help. The PPA Attracts Criminals. When you have a group of men who are willing to resort to violence to prove a point, it is inevitable that the criminal element will soon get involved. As the more successful the raids became, brawlers, bigots, criminals, and the worst sort of men soon signed to be part of the night raiders. Soon the men began taking out their own vengeances and settling their own scores. They would organize into small mobs to exact their own form of law and order, such as a case that happened in Russellville, Kentucky. The second raid happened on August 1st, 1908. 100 men seized the jail in Russellville, Kentucky, and seized 4 African American men. Their names were Joseph Riley and Virgil, Robert, and Thomas Jones. They were local sharecroppers and friends with Rufus Browder, who was also a sharecropper. Browder had an altercation with a landowner by the name of James Cunningham. The story goes that the altercation escalated when Cunningham scourged Browder. As Browder turned to walk away from the situation, Cunningham shot Browder. Browder turned and returned fire, killing Cunningham in self-defense. All of the men were in the jail over the confrontation. Browder was moved to another town jail for his own protection. The other 4 men were innocent, but they had supported Browder and were vocal about their discontent of their employers and were in the jail for those reasons. These men were dragged out of the jail and then taken to a tree and executed by the raiders. The Crittenden County raids. The first raid happened on February 4th, 1908. Doing the same methods that had worked before, the town of Dykesburg, Kentucky was overtaken. W.B. Groves and Henry Bennett were dragged from their homes and severely scourged for refusing to join the PPA. The second raid happened on February 10, 1908, when the raiders took over the towns of Mexico and Fredonia, Kentucky. The farm of former candidate for governor A. H. Carden was raided and had 2 of his tobacco barns burned. The Birmingham, Kentucky raid. On the night of April 9, 1908, the night raiders went into the mostly African American town of Birmingham, Kentucky. The reason was that the community was still working for non-PPA member farms, and they wanted them to move on from working there. While shooting in the houses, African American John Scruggs and his young grandson were shot and killed by the same round of fire. Several of the community were held down and severely beaten and scourged during the raid. Duke in Court and Tobacco Prices. The New York Court of Appeals in late 1908 ruled that Duke Trust was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Under this act, the American Tobacco Company had to be fragmented into different entities under different ownerships. This was appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Tobacco prices began to stabilize around the country, causing an end to most of the violence. However, there was still dispute among the political figures and the law enforcement over those that wanted law and order and those that supported the night raiders. In our next video, we will look at the trials and who was not held responsible for the raids. Did Dr. Amoss and his men face consequences for their actions on the towns and cities? Did the PPA accomplish their goals, or was the law finally enforced to bring down the robber baron? We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for supporting us as we bring to you the history of Kentucky and Tennessee.